Hey folks, Nick here from Another BookTube channel. Today, talking about my most disappointing reads of 2023, as well as my DNFs, or the books I did not finish. Overall, I think that 2023 was a really good reading year, and I had trouble finding books that were that I thought were bad that I had completed. Pretty much everything that I wasn't enjoying, I did DNF. So when making the list of disappointing books, what I want to make clear is that I didn't necessarily dislike all of these. It's just that they didn't quite live up to the expectations I had for them. But not necessarily the worst books that I read, just the ones that I had hopes for, and those hopes were not met. But I am going to start with the DNFs, just because I'm not going to have as much to talk about with them since I didn't finish them. The first book that I'll talk about is Lord of the Vampires by Gina Showalter. I attempted this book during Garb August, where we had the theme week of I think it was trashy romance or supernatural or something. Oh, genre romance. That's what it was. And I chose supernatural romance. And I made a full video about this book and my attempt at it. I tried to give it a fair chance and kind of see it from the perspective of someone who enjoys genre romance and try to find, is this what they like about it? Is this what they like about it? But ultimately, I didn't like it. I got about halfway through it, and I felt like, all right, I get the gist of it. The world wasn't well thought out enough. It wasn't detailed enough for my liking. So I wasn't able to finish it. Speaking of fantasy that I wasn't able to finish, and this one will probably upset a lot of people, it is Memories of Ice by Steven Erikson. It's the third book in the Malazan Book of the Fallen. I very quietly DNF'd this book this year, and I have also made the decision to just DNF this series as a whole. Now, what's interesting is that I enjoyed Gardens of the Moon and Dead House Gates. They are challenging, and Memories of Ice was a challenge. And I got about 15% into it, and I was having the same feelings as Gardens of the Moon or Dead House Gates early on, where I don't know what's happening. I'm just trying to accept everything at face value, and those first two books, maybe it'll come together in the end. But the issue was that I got 15% in, and then I lost momentum on it. I had to put it down because I wasn't getting into a flow. So I put it down to read some other stuff. And then I put it down for, a week. And then a week became 2 weeks, and it became a month. And then when it became time to try to actually pick it up again, I had completely forgotten what was going on. And the idea of trying to re-catch up in my mind, whether it's, using the tour read along online or starting over, it just felt like a mountain that I did not have any interest in climbing. And ultimately, the Malazan fans have been good for this channel because, my first review of Gardens of the Moon did really, really well. And I got a lot of subscribers because of that. So it was a hard decision to basically just say, I'm not doing that series anymore, because some of my subscribers might see this and think, well, now I don't care about this. I was here for your Malazan journey. If you're not going to do Malazan, I'm out. So sorry about that if you're disappointed, but ultimately I wasn't enjoying myself. The books are good. I'm not saying they're not good. I'm saying that they're not for me. And big, respect to everyone that is obsessed with the series and loves it. I'm glad that you enjoy it. I just wasn't enjoying the reading experience. Third DNF I'll talk about is Hush Little Baby by Judy Miller. I have very little to say about this one. I got maybe, I think 30 to 40 pages into it. It was awful. I have no idea what this book was going to be about. It was about a woman who was going to be a surrogate mother for another family who couldn't have a child. But it had this horrible, horrible sexist narrative voice to it. And oddly Catholic and outdated views about adoption and being a surrogate. There was this was unreadable through a modern lens. I'm pretty good usually at being oh, it was a different time period. But this to me just it should be buried in that time period. I hated the few pages I read of this book. Um, Next up for DNF was Full Moon by Jim Butcher, the second Dresden Files book. This was actually the first DNF I did of the year. And I have a short up on Full Moon where I just basically explained that despite the fact that there is so much that happens in this book, Jim Butcher found a way to make it boring. And I know there's hardcore Dresden fans out there, and they've commented on those shorts I made. They've been vocal about how, it gets better after book 2, book 3. Stick with it, stick with it. How do I know? How do I know it's going to really get better? If I didn't really enjoy the first 2, why am I going to continue? There's so much else that I want to read instead. So I don't know. It is an easy reading style. Maybe one day I'll just skip to book 3, but I couldn't get into Full Moon. Next was Wuthering Heights by Emily Bronte. This was another DNF, and I actually did a full video about this book because it was part of my back to school challenge, which I have to get back to. But yeah, this was a book about miserable people that were not fun to read about in any way. Like, I don't mind a miserable character as long as they're interesting to read, and these were just the worst people ever that were just horrible to each other. And there was like, this is a romance? Like, what? No, this is garbage. So sorry, English literature scholars, you're all wrong. No, I mean, I get it. This is another one that I'm just like not interested. Keep this one in college level English lit courses. Get it out of high schools because I don't think high schoolers care about it at all. And then the last DNF is actually my most recent. And if I made this video 2 days ago, this book would have been left off because I DNF'd it yesterday. And that's Treasure Island by Robert Louis Stevenson. What this comes down to is basically what was fun for a small child in 1890 is no longer fun for a grown adult in 2023. This was just full of very boring, dense pirate language, and like maybe if I was a child back then, I would have been super hyped for this. But like, I've seen Pirates of the Caribbean. I've already experienced pirate adventure at its pinnacle. This is just a complete backslide. So didn't enjoy this. DNF'd it. Okay, so moving into disappointments of 2023. So these are books that I finished and didn't meet my expectations. Not necessarily bad, but this first book is bad. I didn't like this book at all. I thought it was garbage, and that's The Forbidden Zone by Whitley Strieber. The reason I'm calling this a disappointment is because earlier this year, I read my first Whitley Strieber book, which was The Wolfen, and I thought that was fantastic. And you'll see when I get to my 2023 book ranking video, it's going to be pretty high up there. I don't know exactly where it's going to fall as of right now, but I really thought The Wolfen was tightly written, super suspenseful, and like violent, and just a really great time, hard to put down, very well written. This was such a slog, and worse, or maybe not worse, but the plot is just completely confusing, makes no sense, hard to follow, and just boring. I hate even talking about this book because it really annoyed me. But it starts with this couple who are like sitting on like a big mound of earth, and they start hearing screams coming from inside the mound. But the mound is solid all the way through. There can't possibly be screams coming from it. But like, other people show up, they hear the screams too. There's like weird vibrations coming from the earth. There's a screeching noise, and then people around the town start acting very strange. And then there's these weird bugs that show up and like invade people's bodies and stuff. It's really disjointed. It's not well thought out. The threat, I feel like, is constantly changing. I don't know. I didn't ever know what the exact danger was, and God, it was just so boring. I was just, and it was just such a slog. And I really should have DNF'd this book. Like, I was at the halfway point, like, this isn't gonna get better. I feel like this is just, it's just getting worse as it goes. And it did. And I should have DNF'd it. I should have not wasted my time. But yeah, Forbidden Zone by Whitley Strieber, awful. um, Next up, a big disappointment, very different, a little bit more mainstream. It's a book that came out this year, The Frugal Wizard's Handbook by Brandon Sanderson. So this was the second book that was part of his Kickstarter, the Secret Project Kickstarter, and it was on its own a book that I didn't really enjoy it that much. I thought it felt incomplete, not fully fleshed out. Brandon Sanderson is really great at world building and just thinking through every little detail. And Frugal Wizard's Handbook felt very loose, in my opinion, and the characters were just not nearly as developed as his usual stuff. But like that on its own, like, it was fine. It just wasn't up to his standard. The reason I'm saying it's a big disappointment is because it followed Tress of the Emerald Sea. So it was part of this Kickstarter, which, it made millions of dollars. A lot of people put a lot of money into it. And the first book, Tress, was phenomenal. I loved Tress of the Emerald Sea. Fantastic. So my hopes were really, really high that everything else in the Kickstarter would be at that level. And to follow it up with such a mediocre book made it even more disappointing. Now, I honestly considered putting The Sunlit Man here instead, but I like The Sunlit Man. I think it's a very good book. But it was another one where it followed Yumi and the Nightmare Painter, which was great. And I just thought it was a little bit of a step down. But I chose Frugal Wizard for this list because not only was it disappointing, it also just wasn't very good. So much so that I gave away my copy on the channel here. So that is my second disappointment. These are in no particular order, by the way. I'm just throwing them out there. The third one is Let's Go Play at the Adamses by Mendel W. Johnson. This was another one I read for Garb August. This is a book that I had my eye on since last year when I read about it in Paperbacks from Hell by Grady Hendrix. He talked about it as a book that really stuck with him for how disturbing it was, and it just kind of it took on this kind of mythic quality in my mind. And then when I eventually finally read it, I found it pretty disappointing. And I've had people push back on the review I posted of it, talking about how it was more relevant and saying more about the culture of the time and the social culture of the time that maybe is lost today. For me, though, I did feel like it was pretty surface level. It was disturbing. It was very yucky. But I didn't think that it was doing enough to say anything. I didn't feel the messaging or the theming was strong enough in it. Maybe I'm in the minority on that. I know a lot of people really love this book, but to me, it was just depravity for depravity's sake, and it just didn't work for me. So that's why I'm considering a disappointment. Next, The Eyes of the Dragon by Stephen King. Love Stephen King. But I don't think he's that great at fantasy. I am very hot and cold on his Dark Tower series, mostly cold, I would say. Although there are definitely some books there that are highlights that I do enjoy. But the series as a whole, not really my thing. And Eyes of the Dragon is another fantasy he did that's more young adult as well. And I put up a full review of this one, and it felt a little too simplistic. It's to the point where you always know what's going to happen next, and so there's no real suspense. Didn't really feel any thrills from it. Just lacked that specific Stephen King voice. Him writing a medieval story. It's just not his strong suit. And this was my second time reading it. I read it first time a long, long time ago. I enjoyed it more then, but I think I was a young adult when I first read it, so that kind of makes sense. So yeah, Eyes of the Dragon by Stephen King, big disappointment. Okay, next up, Children of Dune by Frank Herbert. I love Dune. I think Dune is a great book. And for many years, I did not read any of the other Dune books because I thought Dune is enough. You know, what do I got to get into the extended lore for? Then I read Dune Messiah. I think I read that last year. I forget. And I was like, oh, what a mistake I made. Because Dune Messiah is basically the ending to Dune. Like, it's the real ending to Dune. Because while Dune is a great book, I always felt the ending a little lackluster. Everything wraps up a little too well. Dune Messiah continues the journey or the life story of Paul Atreides, Muad'Dib, and it puts a true conclusion on his story. I feel, and it's to the point where I recommend if you read Dune, you have to read Dune Messiah. I've done a complete 180 on my previous in life stance, and so I thought let's go ahead and continue the Dune series with Children of Dune, the third book, and technically, I guess this would be the end of Paul's story. But my big problem with this book is that Paul is not the main character. It is focused on his children, and I don't find them as interesting. And in general, I thought this was probably the toughest to read book because just what was happening in this one wasn't super engaging, in my opinion. And I haven't read God Emperor of Dune yet because I'm concerned that it's going to be more of the same. Because from this point forward, there is no more Paul Atreides in the series. This is his final book that he appears in, that I know of, that Frank Herbert wrote at least. And I'm worried that I'm just going to not enjoy that at all. It's going to kind of spoil my my enjoyment. So I think I am still going to complete The Golden Path, which is reading the first 4 Dune books next year. So I'm going to try to read God Emperor of Dune, but this one really put me off the series for quite a bit. It really just like killed my my momentum dead on it, which is really disappointing. And finally, the last disappointment I'll talk about this year is a horror book. My Heart is a Chainsaw by Stephen Graham Jones. Now, before I go further, if you're a big fan of this channel and you've been with me for a while, you'll say, Nick, how is The Last House on Needless Street not on this list? Good question. So again, this is about disappointment. These are books that I had high expectations for and felt that they didn't meet those. I didn't have a ton of expectations about Last House on Needless Street. I had heard that it was good, but like no more so than any other book that I had read. So My Heart is a Chainsaw, though, I did have some expectations for because prior to this, I had read 2 Stephen Graham Jones books. The first being The Only Good Indians, which I thought was terrific, and the other was Mongrels, which I really enjoyed. So I thought, like, okay, I'm really building something here. This is a new author that I'm discovering, that I'm really into it. And this book started off really, really strong. It's about a high school girl who's obsessed with horror movies, who believes that there's a serial killer loose in her town because, bodies keep showing up. And it's a really just solid premise. It works as a slasher. Jay Daniels, the main character, can be a little annoying because we spend so much time in her head, and she can just be annoying. But what really killed this book was the ending. So for the first 3/4 of this book, things are one way, and then in the last quarter, in the climax, the ultimate ending, it becomes something completely different. And those 2 tones, to me, did not create a cohesive whole. I didn't want the ending that we got because I didn't feel like it was set up enough at all. To me, it felt like it came completely out of nowhere, and it really just like wrecked my enjoyment of this book. Maybe now that I know how it ends, if I were to read it again, I'd be prepared for it. Maybe I'd feel differently. But on the first go through, I was so disappointed in how this ended. That being said, the sequel, Don't Fear the Reaper, I enjoyed through and through. I thought that was a really solid second entry. I gave that book, I think, an 8 out of 10. But this one, yeah, that ending, it doesn't fit. I'm sorry, it doesn't fit, and I'll die on that hill. So yeah, those are my most disappointing reads of 2023 and the books that I DNF'd. Let me know if I'm completely wrong about these. If you're a Malazan fan, if you're a Dresden fan, please go easy on me in the comments. I am just a small boy. I'm just a human being, and we all have personal, subjective tastes, and neither of us is right or wrong. But yeah, I would love to hear your thoughts about any of these books in the comments below. Thank you very much for spending some time with me today, but now it's time to get back to reading.